Let's say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu
Elohim
melech haolam
Haolam
asher kitanu b'mitzvotav
that's divine
v'la'asot divrei Torah.
Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, now this is going to be deceptive because both of these mitzvot are very short, but they are huge in importance. So I need somebody to read verse 12 from Deuteronomy and verse 8. Wait a minute, is it verse 8? No. Verse 8 in Numbers.
I'll read.
Okay,
Okay. First I'll do which one do you want me to do first? Does it matter?
doesn't matter.
Okay. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. The other
Okay,
one, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
all right. So what is the difference between the two texts?
One is remember and observe, but the other is that the Deuteronomy adds the phrase, as the Lord your God has commanded you.
True. But before we even get to that addition, there are two distinctly different formulations of the reason for the commandment to observe the Sabbath. In one case, we are told that we are supposed to observe the Sabbath, or the old translation used to be to keep the Sabbath day. And the other one says we are supposed to remember the Sabbath day.
Well, I have a question first. Is, sometimes we talked about how the books of the Torah are not necessarily sequential in terms of when things happen, or we don't.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so but you would first observe and then you could remember after that, like remember to observe. So here they seem sequential.
Well, but you could read them sequentially either way. Like you can't observe unless you remember. So maybe you have to remember first.
So what does remember mean, I guess, is a question. Does it mean remember to observe, or
just
remember?
That's part of what we are trying to discuss here.
Okay.
The word is zachor, and the imperative of the Hebrew root meaning to remember. Zecher is a remembrance. It means to literally remember. But maybe it means more than that too. But we'll leave it at that for the moment. But on the other side of the page, in Deuteronomy, it says shomor et Yom HaShabbat l'kodsho, to keep or to guard the Sabbath day in order to sanctify it. So something more is added here. We're not just to remember, but we're supposed to do something about it, and that doing something has a purpose, to keep it holy.
Well, both have keep it holy.
Right. But in the Numbers, the Exodus version, I'm sorry, it's not linked necessarily to an action, whereas in the Deuteronomy section it is. But you're right, both of them refer to the purpose of keeping the holiness of the Sabbath. In one case, you do it by remembering it. In the other case, you do it by guarding or keeping it.
Okay, so I looked back, I'm looking at the plow, right? I'm looking at the plow. And the comment on the Deuteronomy part and versus the Exodus part is tradition treats the difference, suggests that remember refers to positive acts, like sanctification through candles and wine and Sabbath joy, and observe means to abstinence from any form of labor.
Yeah, that's one traditional interpretation of the rabbis. But
And it also says that the commandment is the only one that exhibits significant differences between the two versions.
well, because shamor, to keep or to guard, implies something very different than to remember. Remembering could be a passive act, so to speak, that you just happen to look at the calendar and you say, oh, what do you know? Today's the Sabbath.
Could we say one's in the mind and one's in the body? Remembering is a mental act, and
Yes.
observing is an action that you do with your body.
Well, maybe so, although I could see that we could look at observing as a mental act as well. But yeah, maybe so. And then why would we add one in or accent one in opposition to the other?
Well,
kind of-
I'm thinking that, oh, sorry,
No, go
I'm
on.
just thinking that this particular interpretation, I don't know the timeline of when
Mhm.
Exodus was written versus when Deuteronomy was written, but-
Deuteronomy's later.
but yeah, how much later about?
Couple of centuries.
Okay, so a lot can happen during a couple of centuries
That's true.
of history, of experience,
Uh-huh.
of interpretation, of looking back and what happened to us, quote unquote. And it seems that not only is it longer in Deuteronomy, it's more developed, it's more specific than
Uh-huh.
what was written in Exodus. Observe instead of remember. Keep it holy is the same as the Lord God, your God has commanded you. That was added, maybe because the 200 years has shown that these people are very stiff-necked and they're not going to, they need to be reminded of the fact that this is what the Lord, your God has commanded you, but they need this reminder. They need all the instruction that they can get because they get into trouble without it, it seems.
Well, they get into trouble even sometimes with it. But
Even
yeah,
sometimes with it, exactly.
without it is probably more likely.
Yes.
Remy's
Okay.
trying to say something.
I'm sorry?
Remy is trying to say something.
Oh, Remy, you're on.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Just reading the text without commentaries, just looking at the text between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, it says, remember, just like what Kim said, it's the intellect. When you remember and it's an instruction, you make an effort to think it through, to reflect what it means.
Mhm.
And then, you know, and then the second part is keep it holy. You know, what does it mean to keep it holy? And there's a lot of, I'm sure, a lot of commentaries in there. And the Deuteronomy 12, observe, like Kim said, it requires action. To me, observe is also an intellect, but in this context, to me, it's more pointing, doing something, what to observe the Sabbath as a holy. There's something that must be done to keep it holy. And what are those things?
Yes. So, what is the association that we have with the word shamor, to keep or to guard? Can you think of any usage that we commonly have in Judaism
The
for
shamas,
that root?
right, the shamas,
The what?
the shamas for the Hanukkah candle, right? Is that the same?
No, that's
No,
a
okay,
different route.
all right.
You're on the right track.
It's in one of the chants. It says, Shamor v'sachor v'dibur echad.
That's right. Well, you see,
I'm trying to remember which one it is. Is that Lachadodi?
The Chalodi, you're right. And there's a neat trick in that lyric. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Okay, anybody want to take a stab at translating that?
Well, Echad is one.
Dibur, anybody? We are reading the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 sayings. Okay? Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. The Shamor and Zachor b'dibur echad, in one expression. Why would we come up with something like that? On the assumption that whoever wrote the lyrics of the that particular hymn knows what the words mean. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Keeping and remembering in one word. Somebody
So
said,
it's saying that there's no difference between them?
What?
That either word involves both words automatically?
well, don't you have a problem, which Judy was referring to, I think, in that these are two mitzvot that have very substantial differences. Unlike some of the others, where there are differences that maybe not so substantial. What's the problem with these two texts? In one text, you're given the reason for observing the Sabbath. We're supposed to remember it. In the other text, we're given a very different reason for observing the Sabbath, because we're supposed to keep it or guard it. Very different sense about it.
Well, that's
And
not a
what we-
reason. It's not a reason to do it. It's
Why
what
not?
you're supposed to do.
Well, maybe, okay. But the problem is the two texts differ substantially. And yet, how do we explain that these are both coming from God, as it were? They are part of the 10 Commandments, and yet the text is different. What do you do with that? What's the problem?
Well, like Judy said, it looks like there is a reminder in Deuteronomy 5 when it's the last phrase, as the Lord your God has commanded you. That is not present in Exodus 8.
That's true. The two texts differ substantially. How can it possibly be true that the two commandments in the 10 Commandments don't say the same thing? Isn't that a problem?
Well, if you assume in Exodus that it came from God, then it does. It's just not written.
Well, yeah, but the whole point is that does come from God, and it is written, and it doesn't say the same thing. In one case, we are told that we keep the Sabbath in order to remember, and in the other case, we keep the Sabbath in order to do or to keep.
I'm with Judy in the 200 years that had gone by and something else was needed.
Maybe so,
Well, don't we have two different audiences?
possibly.
Well, in Deuteronomy, he's talking to the Israelites who have gone through the wilderness and they're getting ready to enter the promised land. And
Right.
they were not the same people that received the commandment
Right.
in Exodus.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good point, Kirby. I'm with you.
But why would you change the language? Why wouldn't you just repeat the same language?
Good
Unless-
question.
That's the point I'm getting at.
Yeah, I understand.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead.
could it be when you're referring about 200 years in between the writing of Exodus to Deuteronomy?
Uh-huh.
Could it be there is I don't know what happened. There's got to be something that happened. 200 years is a long time.
A long
Different
time.
generation and different happenings.
They are about to intermingle with the Canaanites. So they are being observed. They're being told, you observe it. It's more than just remembering. When you're just by yourselves in the wilderness, you're going to now be exposed to other people, and you observe. Maybe that's the reason.
Other people who don't observe the Sabbath.
Right.
And you're going to have to not just remember the Sabbath, but you're going to have to observe it. So maybe so. Maybe it has to do with the changing context
Mm-hmm.
of the Israelites who are about to cross over into the land.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good possibility.
Mhm.
It doesn't solve our problem exactly, though, because what you're suggesting, which may be true, is that the two commandments don't mean the same thing. And if they don't mean the same thing, then what do we do about the holiness of the text or the source of the text? How do we account for the change? It may be a good change. It may be a helpful change. But why is there any change at all? And doesn't it undermine the unitary source of these commandments?
Well, maybe not, because as we mentioned before, that God needs the Israelites and the Israelites need God. And
Yes.
so there is a development of the Israelites as a people, as a nation throughout the story. And the development can mean a lot of different things. And
Sure.
so as time goes by, and as experiences happen over 2 centuries, and as God observes the people going through different things of obedience, disobedience, more disobedience, more obedience, and that God needs to also edit edit what needs to be done with the people, because God and the people always interact. God does not act totally by itself. It needs the people. So I'm thinking that this adjustment was a response by Adonai to to kind of keep up with the situation historically and in terms of experience that happened.
This is a very important point, because the implications are that God will, depending upon the needs of the people he is speaking to, or the changing conditions in which they live, or what have you, God is willing to alter the text.
Well, actually, everybody's read the commentary, I guess, because you're all doing the commentary. It's great. It says critical scholars believe them to be due to varying traditions. Rabbinic opinion, remember, that's different, insisted that the Deuteronomic version was in some miraculous fashion proclaimed together with the text reported in Exodus. So they both happened at the same time, according to the rabbis.
That's the rabbinical solution, which is Shamor Rizachor B'Dibur Echad. Keep and remember in one expression, in one utterance. That's what the rabbi's solution is. Somehow, miraculously, both words were included in one utterance.
Right.
Well, yeah, you say
right,
like it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal, because it implies that the meaning of the text is not nearly as fixed as we normally assume it to be. That even the pshat, the simple meaning of the text, is subject to variation. Now, that doesn't bother me. I'm a person who lives in the 21st century. But if I were an Orthodox Jew, I would have a problem with this. Why would I have a problem? Because the text can't change.
Mhm.
The text has to be stable. You know, the saying is you cannot add to or take from the words of the Torah. That's a commonplace rabbinical statement. And what it means is you can't alter the text. But here we have an example of the text being altered, and we can come up with a whole variety of reasons why there is justification for doing that. I don't have a problem with that.
Rabbi,
Yes.
thank you for making us think about this.
Okay.
And I'm always thinking about, there is a phrase, a text without a context is kind of like an open, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, who are the people who wrote Deuteronomy? The priestly priests, or who are they?
That's a good question. It's part of what's called the Josianic Revolution. This is a very thoroughgoing revision of the laws and the customs and so forth that took place under King Josiah, which is why it's called Josianic. There are many other examples of differences between parallel texts as they appear before the days of Josiah and during the days of Josiah. This is just, some people would say, another example of that. But that, again, doesn't really solve our problem, because either God speaks and speaks correctly, or God's speech is subject to alteration for whatever good reason we might adduce. As a liberal Jew, I don't have any problem with either of those. But if I'm an Orthodox Jew, I have a lot of trouble with that.
What do they do with that?
Well, they do exactly what we were referring to before. I had a professor at HEC named Larry Hoffman, pretty well known among liturgists. And one of his great maxims was, whenever there was a theological problem that couldn't be resolved, it was expressed in the lyrics of a song. So you can just sing right through it and not pay attention to the philosophical or the theological problems. This is one of them. We all sing every Shabbat, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, yishri anu egel ha'miuchad. We don't even think about it. But what the text is saying is these two words, which give the justification for keeping the Sabbath, Shamor and Zachor, somehow are expressed as one word by God, or they're in one utterance, so that you don't have it. That would remove the problem of the text changing, but not by a lot, because the text would still be complicated in a way that nobody who follows the text as it is written would be willing to countenance.
So the Orthodox basically don't deal with it. They just sing through it. They
They
don't.
fudge it. If anybody here is a bridge player, it's called a finesse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And they finesse the difference between Shamor and Zachor by saying, well, they're really only one utterance.
Mm.
They're clearly not one utterance. They're two different words.
That's Rashi's take, that both versions were spoken and written simultaneously, and they were heard simultaneously as well, as the Lord your God has commanded you, as he commanded you at Marah before the giving of the Torah.
Yeah, right. I mean, the answer from Rashi, as is classically the case among the rabbis, is that they're really the same. But it's manifest that they are not the same because the text preserves these differences. So either they're the same, in which case one of the words is redundant, or they are not the same, in which case there is some important difference which requires two different words. You can't have it both ways. Rashi normally gives us very interesting and reasonable solutions to these kinds of problems, but this is not one of them.
Yeah, Nachmanides says, observe the Sabbath day. In Exodus, it is to remember rather than to observe. The straightforward explanation is that Moses has begun to expound the commandments. According to our sages, both words were said in the same utterance, and that what Moses expounded to them here, they all knew to remember, but now he informed them that observe had been spoken along with it. The true explanation is also that both were spoken in a single sentence. The voice itself expressed both as remember and observe. The Torah is an eternal pact drawn up to be observed, and he references 2 Samuel. Moses heard the remember aspect, but the Israelites heard only the observed aspect.
I'm sorry, who only heard the observed aspect?
This is not Maimonides.
But you said somebody heard only the observed aspect. Who was that?
Well, he's also saying that one who is enlightened will understand that remember is a positive commandment and refers to the day, while observe is a prohibition and refers to the night.
Yeah, I think that is a dubious interpretation. Observe seems to me to be a positive commandment, not a negative one. When there is this division among commandments that the rabbis refer to, of positive commandments, negative commandments, but both of these seem to me to be positive. That you must positively observe the laws connected with the Sabbath, and you must positively remember it. It's something that you do. I think that's comes under the small, fortunately small, but noticeable category of lame interpretations.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's not like saying that what you're supposed to observe is something you're not supposed to do. It doesn't make it less a negative commandment. So anyway, I don't think that solves our problem for us. What is the nature of the problem exactly? What would be the problem if we were to grant, for the sake of argument, that Shamor and Zachor are two different words, making these two different commandments? What is the problem that emerges from that? Anybody?
Well, I think simply that there wasn't one author.
Well, all right, so these two particular commandments written by different authors.
At different times, yeah.
At different
For,
times.
for, as Judy said, different purposes.
That's a possibility. Okay.
But what about the idea of the living Torah, that this is not a static, the Torah is not a static entity, but something that is continually changing and growing?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that at all.
I know you don't,
Well,
but would an Orthodox person acknowledge that, or?
No,
Oh, okay.
not to the extent that the text would change. You know, we might have different interpretations of the text, but not that the text would change in order to change the meaning. I say, here's our problem, and it's a problem not just among Jewish scholars, but among Christians as well. What do you do when you have conflicting versions of the same commandment or the same admonition, as happens quite frequently in Scripture? And it's not an isolated example that happens here and you never see again anywhere else. There are plenty of examples where of similar commandments where the language is different and the meaning is different. It's a problem.
The
Yeah,
general response would be the context. Any interpretation is influenced by the context
that's
of
true.
where it is. And so I think that would influence.
I agree with you. But who gets to determine what the context is? Is the context something that is given to us by God? God says, this is the context, or is it a human interpretation of Scripture?
Rabbi, may I speak, please?
Of course, yeah.
I'm thinking, like you said, if there are two conflicting texts, they're opposite. The way I look at it, if the one that is conflicting, whereas the other one is more or less positive, but it appears in the Torah maybe nine times, whereas the other one only appears one time. If I am reading the material, I would say, you know what, I'm just going to ignore it. The 9 times the Torah is telling me to be good to do that, I'll follow that, versus 1 time.
That is a very practical solution. But I think you can, upon reflection, you'll notice that it's not an entirely wonderful conclusion, because it doesn't help us with understanding why the one time there is an aberration is even included in Scripture. Why is it there? If it has no implication for us to pay attention to.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to run through the commentary, and it says that the difference is that in Genesis, it's part of the, creation story, the seventh day.
Yes,
You remember the Sabbath day. And for Deuteronomy, it's to remember the experience of what the Jews have been through.
okay.
And so the day is, it's anchored in God's kinship. But anyway, so there's a lot of discussion on this, but the first time we have the commandment in Exodus 20, but we also already had the Sabbath day, Shabbat, in creation. Did we have it anywhere between creation and Exodus?
No, it's the 10 Commandments first appear.
So
in
these are the only times it's mentioned. And then along the way, I know
Well, it's also
Leviticus, it's mentioned. I mean,
yes.
after, yeah. So that's kind of interesting. So this is kind of an evolution. First, it's the creation, then it's Exodus, and then it's discussed a lot in Leviticus. And what happens if you don't observe the Sabbath? And
Right.
they use the word observe, right? They don't use remember.
Yeah, it should share more.
Right. So
It's
now
more-
we're using the word observe.
So I was trying to get at something a little bit earlier, which unfortunately laid a bomb. I'm going to try it again. Where Where do we find this word, this root, shin mem resh, commonly? If you observe the Sabbath, what do we call it? We say that you are shmirat Shabbat, that you are a keeper of the Sabbath. Okay, Shamor has the implication of following the laws or the customs. Okay, remembering does not. You can remember something without being necessarily tied to the actual laws. So I'm going to make my point, which is that the two words here mean something very different, that they are maintained in the scripture because each one adds a different kind of meaning to the question of the reason for observing the Sabbath. So let me ask the question. If remembering the Sabbath or keeping the Sabbath are both important, but they are not the same, you would understand why we have two different formulations. But why is it important to make sure that we Israelites are aware of this difference between guarding or keeping on the one hand and remembering on the other? Why do we keep both of them? Why don't we just get rid of one? Yeah,
Rabbi,
Rabbi?
I'm kind of thinking that remembering, because there are situations in the history of the Jewish people when they left Egypt, that they were facing a lot of challenges.
Sure.
And I'm sure that the seventh day, sometimes they didn't have any choice except to face those challenges. I mean, enemies. Could it be that remembering you cannot really observe the Sabbath if you are in a war or something?
Yeah. So remember is there in order to maintain the efficacy of Jewish guilt. You're not keeping the Sabbath, but we want you to remember anyway, so that you know you're not keeping it. We want you to feel bad about that. Okay. I've only been somewhat
Facetious.
but there is something here that I think is worth paying attention to. If shamor, keeping or guarding, is about the actions connected with the Sabbath, following the various customs and laws and so forth, what would be added by to that meaning by having the word zachor, to remember? So a couple of folks, Kim and I think Judy, referred to the mental aspect, maybe Remy too, of remembering. What is it you're remembering that would be distinct from the customs and the traditions and the laws that we're supposed to keep?
That it was Adonai that took you out of Egypt. That Adonai is the only God possible for you. That we have a contract.
So that it might refer to an historical awareness that we need to maintain. What else might it refer to?
Well,
Yeah, Remy.
Yeah, I'm thinking what just Judy said, being aware of God, monotheistic, because surrounding them, it's all a lot about temptation, worshiping other gods, all the paganism, and God really wants his people to focus on who he is. That's why I keep saying, remember, because if you are surrounded with these challenges, it's probably going to be so easy to be tempted and just kind of follow them, just like when
Sure.
when Moses was talking to God and they were left, and Aaron started building the golden cup. They were very impatient, you know. So
Yes,
I'm
they were.
thinking that's probably what God is saying. Remember, 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 so that we don't forget about him.
Yeah, so you're edging into the area which I think is very important, which is that in order to keep the Sabbath, to guard the Sabbath, it's not enough to know what are the actions you must perform or the rituals one must observe, but you must know what they mean. Why must you know what they mean? Because as you say, there are going to be pressures all around which are going to suggest that you can observe other principles or other ideas. The point of observing the Sabbath is not just to follow the minutia of the law,
Mhm.
but to know what their significance is,
Mhm.
to understand what it means to keep the Sabbath. Uh, that is very different from following even very scrupulously what the commandments themselves are, whatever they may happen to be at a particular period of time. So yes, as Kirby says, maybe the context changes, and one period of time, one way of observing the Sabbath is viewed as more important than another, but either one refers to a theological or philosophical assertion that is different from the cultures around the Israelites, and which points towards the significance of what those rituals or traditions might be. Why do we light candles? Why do we bless the bread? Why, all the things that we do. Why do we not work? Why do we not travel? Whatever particular ones you want to point to, what is the theological principle or what is the meaning of those behaviors? Understanding and remembering what it is we do this for is just as important as doing them. You know, if you just do them, but you don't know what you're doing them for, I think it's a lot easier for you to slip away from the behavior. If you know what they mean, if you know what these actions are for, you're more likely to maintain them. And remember that observing the Sabbath is understood in the Torah text and by the rabbis later as a gift to the world. It's not just for Jews. And therefore, the meaning of the behaviors is even more important, because the average person may or may not observe the Sabbath the way the rabbis have ordained it, but they may follow the principles or the concepts that underlie those behaviors. And this is something that we see in our own day among other groups that observe the Sabbath and don't follow the same rules or the same customs as we Jews do, but they have a sense about what it is that the purpose of the Sabbath is, and they may understand differently what they should or should not do, but they understand what the point of what they should or should not do is supposed to be. So, you know, from this point of view, a Gentile who observes the Sabbath within the context, let's say, of Christianity, can legitimately be said to be observing the Sabbath, even if they don't have challah and wine and candles on Friday night. But there are other ways that the meaning of these ritual behaviors could be enacted. And so the community of people who are observing the Sabbath is really much larger than we might normally think, and not necessarily limited or bounded by religious or ethnic restrictions. I think this is a very important aspect of these two different phrases, Shamor and Zachor. We have both of them to remind us that there is the performance element that binds us as Jews, particularly in terms of how we observe the Sabbath. But the theological or philosophical significance of what we do to observe the Sabbath, which is a general or even universalistic point of view. So I don't want to overdeal with this, but I can't overestimate how important it is to understand how this points towards the universalism of the Sabbath as not just as a practice, but as a concept to undergird human behavior. You think of all the ways in which understanding the necessity of taking rest, the necessity of binding the limits of work to prevent slavery becoming a part of the general way in which we in the West anyway view the social justice aspect of the Sabbath. You know, there are so many rules about how not to abuse labor, whether it's child labor laws or what have you, which grow out of the idea that work is bounded, it's limited by these theological principles. Work is not an absolute in and of itself. And if you approach it that way, you're going beyond what do I want to say, the significance or the meaning of the Sabbath. Sabbath reminds all of us that we are not slaves to the work we do, that we are more than that, and that the work that we do needs to be qualified by the theological meaning of rest. Everybody requires rest. Now I see, is that Stan? Is that your hand?
That's
Yeah,
mine.
me and Kirby both.
Oh, okay.
If you're talking on the same thing, I've got a variant I want to bring up afterward. Go ahead.
Okay.
We can get all tied up in this work and all that. The whole purpose of the Sabbath was one thing: to focus on God. And that
Yes.
is it. That is it. Nothing else. Nothing else is important but to focus on God. So if we get tied up with the process of how that, we can get so ritualistic and legalistic and forget that everything in life, yes, certainly on the Sabbath, is to focus on God. Three words.
Yes, that is true. But what that expression, focus on God, includes is a matter of some discussion. And it's not, we don't all agree on what is required to focus on God. You know, for some people, means being in the synagogue or the church all day. For other people, it means something very different. The idea of focusing on God is not, how should I put it? It's not obvious all the things that are included and all the things that are not included in that. I'll give you an example. We don't work on the Sabbath. However, if someone becomes ill and their illness is a life-saving situation, we are not only permitted, but we are required to ignore the rules of the Sabbath in order to save that person's life. Now, I'm not saying that it makes the general prohibition of not breaking Sabbath unimportant. I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that there are times when our understanding of what is included in the observance of the Sabbath has some variation because either of life circumstances or particular behavior or problem that we face. So, I mean, it's not just that you are allowed to save a life, you are required to save a life, even if it means breaking the Sabbath. So I'm just putting that out there, Kirby and Stan, as an example of how the context is a very powerful what I want to say, a very powerful consideration in what it means to focus on God. It would definitely be a failure of focusing on God to allow one of God's children to die when there is something for us to do to save that person's life. So I'm just saying that there are, at least around the edges, some squishy parts of all this. All right, Stan.
Yeah, I've looked into Nachmanides, or Ramban, and this is one very small part. He goes on for pages about the two different words, but I found this very significant. Remember the Sabbath day constitutes the commandment to remember it continually every day. However, the observance can only occur on the Sabbath.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that
which is in line with what I
this
just
is
said.
another aspect of the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the point is well made because what we remember has an impact on what we do in other circumstances besides just the observance of the Sabbath with its customs and commandments and so forth. A good example to me, besides what I just gave in terms of saving a life, is the idea that there are that we have child labor laws that limit what we can expect of children to do in this context. There is a limitation because it flies in the face of what it means to remember the Sabbath as a theological principle, as something more than just as a set of behaviors. Now, I know that doesn't trump what we do to, as Kirby says, to focus on God on the Sabbath. But it does nibble around the edges, at least, in some circumstances. And that's kind of what I wanted to get on the table here. So having said all that, it seems to me that keeping these two words, having these two different formulations of why we keep the Sabbath is absolutely meaningful, because we're looking at the Sabbath as a particular set of behaviors that have to do with following certain traditions, certain customs, and so forth, all of which, as Kirby points out, are meant to support and to focus our attention on our relationship with God. But at the same time, there is the element of the larger theological principle, which sometimes comes into play on other days, in other contexts, in other situations. And we don't throw that out. We don't, just because it may or may not connect with the observance of the Sabbath itself. So from my point of view, just speaking individually, I think that in a way, this underscores the relevance of Rashi's interpretation, that both the theological or the moral or the judicial side of things and the practical observances on the other hand are both intended by what God spoke in the Ten Commandments. Now, this is what I always fall back on in these circumstances, namely, God speaks in the Torah, as the rabbis say, L'shon b'nei Adam, in the language of human beings. And discrepancies in the text come under that heading. There is a time when God says Shamor. There's a time when God says Zachor. And really, they are both part of the same concept of the Sabbath. Even though in our language, our human language, we don't have a way to express that with one word. We have to use two. So this seems to me to be related very directly to the limitations of human language and the difficulties of God speaking to us in ways that are clear. And sometimes God speaking to us in ways that are clear require more than one word. So let's leave it at that for now. We're at the end of our time. And I want to thank you all for making such valuable contributions to our discussion today. And I hope everybody has a good couple of days and a good Shabbos, and see you all next week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good week. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Pleasure, as always.